Hello, and welcome back to the show. Today's guest is a friend of mine who I've wanted to bring on the show for a really long time. She was actually one of those early guests that I reached out to because I know we have a lot of overlap in our audience. I know a lot of her followers are following me and vice versa. And so I got a lot of requests to bring her on. And you guys know the format of this show, we typically talk about sex, money, and mental health. A lot of times when a creator comes on this show, either they or their PR team will reach out to me ahead of time and ask me for a list of questions so that they can read them ahead of time and just get a little comfortable with what's coming. I typically try to avoid doing that on this show because I do like the conversation to be spontaneous. I don't want planned out media trained answers. As I've shared with you before, that's kind of my reason for doing this show, is to get different answers from what people are used to saying. So I don't really want to give my guests the chance to plot out ways to spin an answer to be super PG or super media trained. That said, a lot of times if you want to get a really good quality guest on the show, you do have to go through those hoops. Liz Moody is, as I mentioned, a close friend of mine. And when I sent her through the questions and the general topics that we were going to talk about, she replied to me that she did not want to come on to talk about the sex or the money aspect, and she was only comfortable talking about mental health. And she sort of gave me her insights and her reasoning on that, and I feel like it's valuable to share with you, and she gave me permission to share this as well. So she told me that from her standpoint as a content creator, it's not actually helpful for her brand in any way for her to dive into things like sex and money. A lot of the creators I bring on this show, I would classify as lifestyle creators who are already somewhat open in the sex and money realms. And a lot of those people do want to dive into the sex and the money. Even if it makes them uncomfortable, it's still fitting with their brand 360. What Liz said to me, which I almost just want to read the text because she gave me permission to share it. Thanks for sending through the questions. The vast majority of the sex and money questions are things I've set boundaries around, specifically to maintain my sanity and my sense of privacy as a public figure, and because they don't fit with my brand or what I'm trying to contribute. Can we keep it to just mental health? So when I first was chatting with her about this was months ago when the show was just starting to air, and I was hoping to iron out this sex, money, mental health taboo topic format. And the idea of a guest coming on and eliminating two of the three big pillars felt like a drawback for me, and I felt like it wasn't going to be fitting with what I was trying to do here on the show. But as time has evolved, and as I've had more episodes come out that I guess I would consider to be more topical driven and less covering all three pillars, especially our audience caller episodes where we have people coming on to talk about one specific story, I realized that there are certain instances and certain cases where this could make for a really good episode. And in the case of Liz Moody, it's not just like a standard lifestyle creator who wants to come on and only wants to talk about mental health, where we're going to have this generic mental health conversation. In the case of Liz, she has been so open about her mental health in the past, and she's shared things about her agoraphobia, about her anxiety. We really didn't even get into it in this episode, but she has shared a lot in her past about disordered eating. She has been through a whole roller coaster of mental health challenges in her life, and yet here she is now, almost on the polar opposite end of the spectrum, as a wellness creator and an author of a book called 100 Ways to Change Your Life. She's really truly turned herself around from a very low point to the place she's at now, which is just high above the mountain peaks. So I felt like we can make an exception for this episode, and we can really focus on the mental health aspects with Liz, something that is fitting with her brand, something that she does feel like is helpful for her as a creator, but an area that I know you guys are interested in as well. And perhaps we can go deeper and poke further and really get to the heart of these mental health challenges. If you're listening and there's any particular moment where you have a major takeaway or a light bulb moment, please take a screenshot of your phone as you're on Apple or Spotify or watching on YouTube, and please tag us on Instagram. I'm at Lucie B. Fink. The show is at The Real Stuff Pod, and Liz is at Liz Moody. I'm going to drop all of her handles, including a link to her book, down in the show notes. And before we dive into it, I want to touch on one thing from a previous episode on this show. So if we go back to the episode that I did with Sam Matthews, who was the surrogate baby carrier, A lot of you probably remember that Sam gave kind of a controversial take there, which is very in line with her religion and her views, where she basically shared that she would not feel comfortable carrying a baby for a same-sex couple. If you listen to the episode, this came in way at the end. I asked her that question, she shared her answer, and then after the interview portion, I popped back onto the mic to make sure to do a little recap and takeaway of what had just happened and to make sure that it was clear what my views were on this situation, which is, just to reiterate, that I have very different religious views from Sam, and that I myself, if I were a gestational carrier, would absolutely carry for a gay couple. I think the thing that she actually said that came across in the most off-putting way to people was her notion that a gay couple wouldn't necessarily be able to raise a child, quote, right. And that she, as the carrier, feels like it's her responsibility to entrust the child into the care of the couple, and that she doesn't feel like she'd be doing right by the child to put them in that sort of family. And that area was just absolutely opposite from my beliefs as a person. And I know that this community feels similar to me in this scenario. So I needed to make sure that I pop back onto the mic to sort of recap everything and make sure it was clear where I lie in this discussion. But I wanted to thank you guys for a few things. So first of all, thank you so much to the audience members who listened to that episode and who listened all the way through to what I shared after that portion. And thank you for thanking me. A lot of you actually thanked me for keeping that portion in because, listen, that's what this show is about at the end of the day. I haven't had many extremely opposing views to mine yet on the show, but I am trying to craft a realistic vision and view of humanity here, and there are many people in the world that share Sam's views. So I don't think the answer is cutting that portion out or not talking to people that have a view like that. But there was one comment, I don't know if it was on YouTube or where, but it was, I think the most useful comment for me was that if you were going to hear an opposing view like that you actually would have preferred that I take it even deeper and go further. And, in the case of this conversation, if we're going to talk about her views on same-sex marriage, then diving in a little bit further to her thoughts about women's reproductive rights and just kind of getting even deeper than we went, because the truth is she said what she said. I made my counter argument, and then we sort of agreed to disagree because we were at the end of the episode and we moved on. And upon listening to the episode back, I absolutely agree with this comment that if we are going to have conversations like that and people are going to present such oppositional views to mine, that's the opportunity to go deeper. And what I want to share here is that as the host of this show, I'm still very much learning how to navigate hard conversations, especially a conversation like that where I have not yet had a guest on the show that has such a strongly held view that diverges from my viewpoint of the world. It's one thing to have someone send you an email and to collect your thoughts and think back what you want to say and type it out to them a week later. It's another thing when you're having a live, real-time conversation with someone to be able to collect your thoughts and go deeper in the right way, in a way that's appropriate, that just reflects what everyone that's listening wants you to incorporate. So it's a learning curve for me, for sure, as the host. And thank you all so much for both giving me grace as the host, for listening to my takeaway after that, and for being open to me including topics like that and clips like that in the show, because I really don't want to censor things for you. That's what this show is about. All right, I know you're going to love this episode. Thank you again for being here. Thank you for listening. Let's dive in with Liz Moody.
Welcome to the Lucie Fink, the Real Stuff podcast.
Thank you. Liz Moody, welcome to the show. I've wanted you here for so long, and I'm so excited to finally have this chat with you. We're going to dive in to all things mental health, agoraphobia, anxiety, fear of flying. You've had a lot of mental health topics that you talk so openly about, and I just want to go as deep as possible and hear as many of those deep details that you haven't shared. One thing I know you've talked about a lot is your parents both being therapists, correct?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, both of my parents, and then my sister is finishing her PhD in psychology right now, and then both of my husband's parents are therapists as well.
Oh, wow. Have you ever considered going into that field?
I haven't, but I feel lucky because it touches on elements of the work that I do now. I get to interview a lot of world's leading psychologists, psychiatrists, people in the mental health space, and I also get to help normalize, validate, and help people work through problems in their life, which is part of what they do in therapy. Although obviously they're professionals and I'm just a layman trying to relay insights from experts.
Take me back to this childhood of having two therapists as parents. What is that like? Are you growing up in this household where everything is just open and flowy and all the feelings are talked about, or what is going on?
To an extent. So my parents are divorced. They got divorced when I was basically between 3 and 5, the divorce happened. So I grew up in two very distinct households. I grew up with my mom, who I lived with during the school year. And then I grew up with my dad, who was remarried to my stepmother, who also was in a part of therapy. They actually met in a mental hospital where they
Wow.
were both working. They were both working there. It had a degree of that, but I do think it also had a degree of like those who can't do teach. And so while there was a lot of talking about emotions are normal, and my dad did a lot of sex therapy, so we had really normal conversations about sex when I was younger. It wasn't modeled in the way that you might think that it would be modeled with therapy. I've experienced it even more with my sister, I would say, in terms of having the benefits of having a therapist in your life, because she is being trained in a completely different way than they used to be trained. And she's being exposed to so many different more modalities of therapy. And as she's going through her training, we're able to have these really open and beautiful conversations about what she's learning and about our childhoods and about how all of that has impacted our lives. But I would say less as a kid it wasn't as idyllic as it might sound.
Did you feel, I guess, I don't know how comfortable you are diving into your parents, but did you feel like your parents' own mental health as individuals was stable?
I feel that it was stable. I think that there's certainly work that they both could have done in terms of their own childhoods and how the patterns from their childhoods were manifesting in their lives at present. I think that they both could have used a lot more tools, but their mental health was certainly stable.
It's really interesting to hear when you say from therapists, like those who don't do teach. I always think, as a person who has a therapist and goes to therapy, that the way this person approaches my life issues, they must be so set and secure in their own life and tackling all of their problems, with perfect cognitive behavioral therapy and structure. And it's just so interesting when you hear from therapists. Actually, a lot of therapists go to therapy.
Oh, I think therapists absolutely need to be in therapy, because when you think about it, they're carrying so much pain and suffering of the world. My dad, particularly, he does therapy with people from lower income brackets, and they are often experiencing problems with drug addiction and not having jobs and not having homes and things like that. And so he's really privy to some of the really heavy weight of the world. And so I think that
Mhm.
therapists really need a place that they can go and process all of that as well. I also think, and I'm not sure if you've experienced this in your job, but my job is helping people transform their lives, helping people live their best lives. I've shared tools for years to help people live their best lives. I do it on my podcast. I've done it on my social channels. I've done it most recently in my book. And there have been times in that journey where I've felt like an imposter, because I felt like, oh my gosh, I'm sharing all of these tools. People are coming up to me on a regular basis or sending me DMs and saying, you've changed my life in all of these ways. Thank you so much, Liz, which I appreciate and I'm so, so, so grateful for. But I was sitting there and I would be having like an anxious day or a day where I couldn't get out of bed and I was scrolling on my phone and I was like, Liz, you know all of the productivity tools. You have taught people how to not lay in bed scrolling on their phone in the morning. Like, why are you doing this? And I felt like an imposter. And recently I've found so many more of those tools that I've been sharing for years and years working their way into my life. And so I think for therapists, for anybody who's sharing knowledge that helps change other people in any way, those tools are going to find us when we need them. And it doesn't mean that we need to model perfect behavior in all of those tools at any given moment. There's like those who can't do teach, but also those who have the tools aren't always going to be using them, but they will use them when they need them. And we need to have a little bit of forgiveness and grace around that.
And we're going to get into those tools that you've implemented and, how you got from some of your worst anxiety days to being the author of this wellness empire and book. But first, I want to go back to just this childhood Liz who's in this household with your parents, and is your sister your only sibling?
I have 2 half sisters, so they're from my stepmother and my father's relationship.
Did you experience any mental health issues as a really young child, or did a lot of this pop up as you got older?
I've had anxiety for as long as I can remember. I'm not going to get into it in depth here, but my mother had an accident when I was 2 years old. That is the reason that my father and her ultimately got divorced. And it resulted in her being in the hospital for a really an extended period of time and going through recovery around that. And I have had anxiety since as long as I can remember. And I assume a lot of it is related to that incident and the jarring and ripple effects that it had on my family's life.
I've heard you talk about that horseback riding accident, I think,
Yes.
and totally respect you not wanting to get into it, especially, details about it from your mother's standpoint. When you say that it impacted you anxiety wise, do you feel like it was more the fact that anything can happen at any moment and people can be injured and lives can be uprooted?
It was a few things. So I think if you're thinking about from a developmental perspective, from ages 2 to 3 is obviously really formative developmental years. So simply the having your mother be there one day and having her not be there the next day in no way that you can understand or comprehend at that time is difficult for a child's brain, even if you're surrounded by people who are trying to deal with that and help with that in the absolute best way that they can.
And that's because she was in the
In the
hospital.
hospital, yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and she's in the hospital for months. So I think there's that element, and I certainly identify as more anxiously or avoidantly attached, and there's science around how your attachment bonds form around that age and things like that. And then I would say, to your point, I internalized at a very, very young age that the things that they say happen to nobody, the things that they're like, "Oh, there's a 1 in a million chance of that," they can happen and they do happen and they did happen. And when it did happen, the message I got from my caregivers, the message that I internalized for myself was that these things happen and everything is okay. It was these things happen and everything is destroyed. And that really messed with my own sense of resiliency in the face of challenge. In addition to statistically, I was sure that not only could I always be the one, but I was likely to always be the 1 in a million.
Which probably isn't helpful. I've heard you talk about the fear of flying and how you did get a stat recently about how many planes are in the air at any given time.
44,000 a day.
There you go. And you probably always thought I was going to be the one in the 44,000 planes in the day that's going down.
Yes. And also, my parents got divorced, like I said, and my mother moved to Arizona and my father lived in California. So my earliest memories of flying are flying by myself between them. So I would be bawling on the plane. I would be crying. I'd be looking. I did a lot of magical thinking. So I had narratives around if the flight attendants were what I perceived as mean in any way, because they were sort of my caretakers when I was an unaccompanied minor. I was like, oh, this plane's going down. I'd be looking for signs in the airport. Because children don't have a lot of power slash any power over their world, they try to take power over their world by thinking thoughts and having power in their minds. And so we get this really overactive intellect, this really overactive brain, because that's the only control that children have at that age. And I certainly found that in myself. I didn't have control over my circumstances. I didn't have control over being put on the plane. I didn't have control over my parents and what they were doing on any day-to-day basis. So I tried to take control over the world in my mind and really develop that muscle, which has served me wonderfully at times in my life. And it also has served me very poorly at other times in my life. I also do think there was a bit of minimizing of the fear. Neither of my parents are afraid of flying at all. And I think they thought I was being over dramatic. And they were like, if there's nothing to be afraid of, then why are we going to compensate for this situation?
Just imagining a 5-year-old on her own. That's so young and so
It's
sad.
so young. No, it's wild to me. I was so young.
I mean, there's definitely at least a little T trauma that comes with those experiences of just being off in the world on your own. I want to understand your timeline of life, because I know that at some point you lived abroad, and when you were abroad, my understanding of Liz is that you were partying,
Oh,
I
okay.
think drinking, doing some
Yes.
sort of drugs.
So we have a few timelines, and that's why it's maybe
Yes.
confusing. I've lived abroad multiple times, which is why it's perhaps confusing. So when I was in college, I would basically go to school for a semester and then I would go travel for a semester. And I just wanted to see the world. I took a gap semester between high school and college, and that's when I really became addicted to backpacking. I traveled on like a super shoestring budget, but I loved it. And I would travel all around Europe, all around South America by myself. And that's when I was in my more party days and staying out all night and doing pretty much every drug that you could think of.
And
I
just so I'm
lived
clear, this wasn't, I know you did take a gap year, but then the times that you went in college, that wasn't study abroad, or you
no,
weren't
no,
going to
no.
college abroad. You were taking gap semesters.
Yeah, I was taking gap semesters and I did it under the guise of like, this'll save some money if I go like there was one point where I like ran out of money for school and I was like, oh, I can like go live in South America for way, way cheaper for a semester while I like replenish the bank account. But it wasn't well constructed or a good plan
Right.
from a fiscal perspective. But I remember sort of justifying it in that way. And also I had a real sense of like, doing it for the narrative. I'd been writing my newspaper column since I was a teenager at that point. So, a little background on that. When I was a teenager, I walked into my local newsroom and I said, you guys should have a column for teenagers and it should be written by me. And they were like, okay, cool. So, I wrote that for my local paper for a number of years, but then that ended up being nationally syndicated. And so, I was writing this newspaper column and I had this sense from a very young age of like, do it for the story, like live your life for this narrative that you can get out of your life. And so I loved the idea. I was reading a lot of Joe Didion at the time. I loved the idea of going out and having these like far flung adventures and then capturing them in my column and sharing them with people. And so even these crazier, scarier adventures that I had abroad, I always thought like, oh, well, that's fine because I can write about it in my column later.
This version of Party Liz feels so foreign to me because it sounds, I mean, maybe correct me if I'm wrong, but something about, I don't know if it was your upbringing or just you innately, almost has this fearless quality of being able to go to South America and backpack and be out and about at bars late at night in foreign countries. Young Lucie would have been terrified. I would have thought
Hmm.
that I was going to be kidnapped or attacked. I think I had a very strong fear as a young woman of just me being a small body existing in the world and
And I
other people
was
being.
like all of the above, to be clear. Like
So
it
you felt
wasn't.
that way, but you were still like, I'm
Oh
doing this
no,
for the
like I
plot.
was kidnapped and I was attacked.
Excuse me? Have you talked about this?
A little bit. It was in Morocco, and I really don't like to talk about it very much because I think Morocco is a wonderful country, and I've gone back a number of times since, and I feel very safe there. And it was completely a result of my own stupidity, where I went off with a unlicensed tour guide who told me that he could take me to a place that basically women were not recommended to go alone. And I thought I was protecting myself because another woman was going and I was like, oh, she's older than me. She's a fire dancer who was like traveling around Africa at the time. And I was like, oh, she's older and wiser than me. So if she's saying yes, then it's probably okay. And he just ended up being really bad news. And we ended up having to get like barricaded in a hotel room away from him and then like take a bus in the middle of the night to Fez where we took out a restraining order against
You
him.
and this woman together
Me and
were like escaping together.
Yeah. And the restraining order was garbage because like they're not going to do anything. But I don't like to talk about it too much just because I love Morocco so much and I don't want to give people the sense that Morocco is unsafe or anything in that way. It was really just my own foolishness of behaviors. If there's any lesson from the story, it's like don't go off with an unlicensed tour guide that you know nothing about on a multi-day adventure.
Wow. Well, listen, I don't think the takeaway is going to be don't visit Morocco. I think we can
No.
all, and especially in this day and age, horrible, crazy shit is happening everywhere. And I mean, I'm the first
In the
to.
US. So I'm like, when people ask me if I feel unsafe in other countries, my answer is like, obviously it depends on the country, it depends on the area. Please travel wisely and use caution. But also there are many parts of the US that I feel equally unsafe in, I also have always had the sense that life is short. And I don't know if that comes from my mom's accident, but I have always had the sense that if I let fear get in the way of me living my big life, I will have more regrets from that than if I live my big life and something bad happens. I have a real sense of existential ambition and existential anxiety and an acute awareness of, I guess, my impending death. And I don't mean that in a grim way. I have a tip in my book that's called Think About Your Death. And it's one of the top 3 tips. It's one of the ones that I really ask everybody to read. The rest of the book is meant to be more of a poo-poo platter you can pick tips from. But I think it's because thinking about your death gives you such a strong sense of perspective about what matters in your life, what you should put your energy to, what you should prioritize. And I've had that sense for as long as I can remember, this idea that my life is going to end at some point, and I really want to fill it with as many adventures and experiences as possible in the time that I'm here.
I definitely grew up without that feeling, totally afraid of death, major fear of even talking about that concept. And as I've aged, I'm more in a place where 100% thinking about the fact that we're all going to die and that we're all just part of this living collective of humans, that everyone that ever came before us is already gone and we're just going to be joining them soon, makes me feel calm and at ease for some reason. And I read that tip in your book and definitely can feel that way now. But I think one of the reasons I haven't done drugs in my life is especially because in the younger years when it was presented to me, I had that insane fear of something going wrong and my body losing control and just shriveling away and dying. And I'm curious if you remember your first experience ever with a drug.
I would say, so I don't necessarily remember my first experience with drugs. A problem with drugs is that it makes answering that question harder than you would maybe like it to be. I smoked a lot of weed in high school, and then in college, I fell in with a group who they felt like the cool kids to me. And a lot of the culture around that was like doing a lot of cocaine and ecstasy and partying a lot and just kind of living a life that felt older, faster, all of these different things. And it's been something I've had to deal with a lot of regrets around. I kind of wish I'd had more of a traditional college experience, but I dove into this world with this group of friends because they felt really cool to me. And I didn't feel cool to myself at that point. I really wanted that outside validation that I was with the cool kids and that we were like the hot, fun party girls. And if I'm being really honest, that's why I did a lot of the drugs that I did, was the perception of being part of that crowd rather than the reality of being interested in the drugs themselves. And I wish I could have had a little bit more love for myself at that time and just said, like, you are enough, you're great, people like you, you don't need to do all these things to be liked, because that was the impetus behind a lot of it.
Do you feel like you always felt in school that sense of, I guess the word is not having incredible confidence around yourself and feeling like you looked at other people and you wanted to fit in?
A sense of not enoughness is something that I've struggled with my entire life. I think I was always looking to external sources to validate my worth, whether that was being part of a certain group at school, or I did a lot of performance as a child, whether it was an actual performance in theater or just trying to kind of like dance my way into attention at a dinner table. And I think that came from not feeling inherently like I had that sense of worth. So I was always looking for others to tell me that I did, and that was a constant narrative. And the thing about that is, even if tons of people are telling you that you have that worth, and this is something that I've really experienced in my adult life, is I have hundreds of thousands of people who are willing to tell me how great I am, and I think constructed a life not accidentally that's led to that. But if you don't have that inherent sense of self-worth, then all of that actually even chips away at a sense of value without those things, without the performance, without the dancing at the dinner table, without the followers, without the books, without all that stuff. So a journey I've been on in recent years, and I'm really happy to say that I feel a sense of inherent lovability, inherent value now that I've never felt before. But it's been a real journey in recent years to say, who am I without all of these things? Who am I without the performance, and is that person lovable, and how can I work on giving myself the love that I need.
And we will get into that a little bit when we discuss the Hoffman process, which you just went through. Going back to this Party Liz time. I keep calling you Party Liz. That's
You
my
can
new
call me
name for
Party
you.
Liz. Yeah, yeah. I like to think though, wait, I want to linger on that for a second, because this is something I've dealt with so much in my journey into intentional drinking, which is what I call the way that I approach alcohol in my life now. I drink very, very occasionally, but I always have a reason for drinking when I do drink. And a huge part of that journey for me has been realizing that I can be Party Liz whenever I want to be Party Liz, and that I don't
Yes, you can.
need alcohol, or back in I haven't done drugs in years and years and years, but back then I would have been like, oh, if I smoke some pot, I'll be funny. If I snort some coke, I'll feel hot. If I do MDMA, I'll feel more connected and I'll dance more and I'll just be more fun. And then with alcohol, for years my narrative was like, this is what is letting me loosen up and put on a show and enjoy myself and connect with other people. And so critical to my journey in drinking less has been realizing that I am, in fact, all of those things. I am Party Liz. I am calm Liz. I am caring Liz. I am warm Liz. I am all of the Liz's, and I get to choose how I show up. And giving a substance that power is taking that power away from me.
And there is such a culture around drinking, especially in those college years when there is a lot of peer pressure. And as someone who had almost like a stomach allergy to alcohol, I don't know what my problem was, but almost every time I drank more than 2 drinks, I would throw up. Even before getting drunk, I would just throw up.
Oh,
So it
wow.
wasn't enjoyable to do. And I had so many nights out in college. And, I had a long distance boyfriend. I had so many nights out where people would be like, you're so drunk. And I'm like, I didn't drink. And it really can come from within. Like, you can be a fun party person without that. So that's a great reminder for everyone. Agoraphobia is something that I think you're the first person I ever even heard that word from. Explain what it is, and can you talk a little bit about that lowest point?
Yeah, I don't know the exact definition, but it's basically a fear of going outside, and it tends to be a self-perpetuating fear. So often somebody will become afraid of having a panic attack when they leave their house, which will trigger the idea of having a panic attack when they leave their house. And so then you never want to leave your house. For me, that's essentially what it became, where I would have panic attacks when I would leave my house. This is when I was living in London with my now husband. And I would be like at the grocery store waiting in line, and I would start to have a panic attack, and I would have to leave my grocery cart on the floor and run home essentially, or go outside or things like that. I'd be at a pub and I would start feeling a panic attack going on. And eventually you just start to really become afraid of the idea of these panic attacks overtaking you in all of these places, or at least I did in my experience. And then I didn't want to deal with that feeling of discomfort and that feeling of always feeling like one could come on anywhere. And so I made my world smaller and smaller, where I would just hang out in my house in case a panic attack happened, and then I would at least be close to home. And then that world got smaller and smaller, and it eventually became like I didn't like going downstairs because I felt more anxious when I went downstairs. I didn't even like showers were really triggering for me because I felt like very enclosed spaces where a panic attack could come on. So in trying to protect myself from having panic attacks anywhere, my world essentially shrunk down to the size of my bed, because that felt like the place where I was most safe if and when a panic attack did happen.
So it was less about a fear of socially interacting with others or about something about being in the world. It was more about you being afraid of what might happen to you and you being in a public space when that happened.
It totally differs for different people. Often there is something like an initial fear that will set off this fear of having panic attacks. But from my understanding and certainly my experience, the thing that really pushes it into agoraphobia, it goes from fear of actually stuff happening outside to fear of the panic attack reaction of things happening outside. And then you try to protect yourself from that by making your world smaller and smaller.
And when you're sitting in your bed, were there a lot of friends and people in your life that were trying to pull you out and talk to you and help you?
My social community was fairly small at the time. We had just moved to England, and I think being separated from my community was a big part of what triggered it. But certainly, my husband was trying to help me, but also we've been talking about this more recently, and I think that even the times where I was at my worst, I was not very open with people in my life about being at my worst. And so there's a sense when we're going through something like this that like everybody must know because it feels so uncomfortable in our own bodies. And in my own body, it felt the most uncomfortable I've ever felt. It's the closest I've ever been to not feeling like life was worth living because I woke up and I was so uncomfortable from the moment that I woke up every single day until the moment that I went to sleep. And I was sure because those sensations were so powerful in my own body that that was incredibly evident to other people, but it was not. So it's all the more reason, I think, to communicate as much as you can about what you're going through to other people, because it's only been in retrospect that I've been able to open up to the people in my life and say, oh my gosh, this is what I was going through. And they're like, I wish I could have been there more had I known.
So how do you go from being in that state and being at a point where you think is life worth living to somehow climbing out of that? What were some of the steps that when you realized something has to change here?
I think it was that thought of I cannot continue to live feeling this uncomfortable in my body. And I think that's something that's often misunderstood about anxiety is you feel like it's just like, oh, it's something you're thinking about, it's negative, and if you just move through whatever you're thinking about, you'll feel better. But the anxiety that I experienced and that many of the people I've talked to experience is really like a full body experience, and it just feels awful in your body. And sometimes you can attribute it to something in your life, and very often you cannot. And so there's not like a problem to be solved. It's just your body reacting and your mind reacting in this very visceral way. And it was that feeling of I can't go on if I feel like this, so I need to do something about that. So I was laying in bed, and I'd been a journalist for years and years and years at that point. And so I used the only tools that I'd really cultivated over the years, which was asking good questions. So I had my little computer like propped up on the pillow next to me and my cat next to me. She an angel through my anxiety period, let me tell you. But I was sitting there with my cat and my computer propped up on my pillow, and I just started emailing experts and trying to get a sense of why is this happening in my body? What's happening in my brain? What are the mechanisms of action at play? And I treated it almost like I would have treated writing an article, although I did not tell any of them I was writing an article. I was more just like, hey, head of neuroscience at Stanford, what's going on in the brain when you feel anxiety? And one of my core philosophies as a human being is never be the one to say no to yourself. It's played out in so many parts of my life. And the idea is that other people can always say no to you. But you say no to yourself sends this really powerful message that you don't believe in yourself and other people cannot believe in you. But I want us to always have our own backs. And I think that also, when you never say no to yourself, the world can say yes in ways that are so much greater than your wildest dreams. So that's what happened when I sent these emails out. A lot of people never replied because why would they? They were incredibly busy, and a few people did. And I'm so grateful that they did, because with the information that they shared, I started to get a sense of what was going on. And more importantly, I started to gather a little bit of a toolkit for how to feel better. And so it started with really, really, really tiny things like meditating for 5 minutes while I laid in bed, and then thinking about the nutrients that were going into my body for the first time in my life, thinking about the way that nutrients impact anxiety, thinking about the way that my childhood impacted my anxiety, thinking about the way that my physical expression of care and comfort for myself could impact my anxiety. So literally doing things like holding myself, hugging myself, putting my hands on my heart, deep breathing, these little tiny tools that I began to implement and I could implement from the safety of my home slowly, 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 like I cannot emphasize how slowly, started to pull me up out of this hole. And then we moved back to America, to the US. And the thing that I think tipped me the most, which is interesting, is I used all these tools to build a life that began to feel better, that certainly didn't feel as desperately uncomfortable moment to moment as it used to. But I got a full-time job, and having the structure of that job and the community that that job provided was the biggest tipping point for my anxiety. I think it's so interesting. As a person with anxiety, I often try to eliminate structure from my life because I want to give space to, like, If I feel too anxious this morning, I want to sleep in later. If I feel anxious in the afternoon, I want to give space to like not go to that event or do this thing or have this work project due or things like that. But actually, anxiety loves structure. It almost gives like the walls and the foundation for a house, and then you can fill that house with like your beautiful life. But if you don't have that walls and foundation in place, then all of that energy is just going every which way, and it can be really hard to grasp and get a hold of. And so having that structure and then community, I built so much of my brand around the importance of community. My second cookbook is called Healthier Together because I think that community is one of the most under discussed and missing elements of wellness. We're talking about eating vegetables. We're talking about infrared therapy. We're talking about cold plunging, when the longest study of human health and happiness out of Harvard shows that the number one predictor of a long life and the number one predictor of a happy life is the strength of our relationships. And so building back up those relationships for me was absolutely pivotal in my own healing.
And was that role you're talking about that you got in New York, was that Mind Body Green?
Yes.
So what's interesting is this Liz, who is sitting in England sending out emails to neuroscientists, I think I always thought that was the Mind Body Green journalist Liz shooting emails out from her work email. But this is just Liz writing to random people and getting responses from people.
Yeah, I had that skill set. I'd been writing for a really long time at that point, but the Mind Body Green job in New York came after that. And I would say in general, my interest in wellness and my sense that all of the different things that we're doing are impacting how we're feeling on a day-to-day basis was a result of my journey with my anxiety, because that was the first time that I had anything that I even needed to see results with. It was the first time that I got my head around the fact that the way that we feel on a day-to-day basis is a result of everything being connected. It's what we eat, it's the people we talk to, it's the thoughts that we think, it's the stories that we tell ourselves, it's the way that we move our bodies. And that ended up being the foundation for my entire philosophy and what I lay out in my book, 100 Ways to Change Your Life. It has 18 categories and they feel really disparate. You have like success and relationships and longevity and gut health. And the reason they're all in there is because I believe something we need to talk about way, way, way more is that they're all connected. So when we try to sort out these problems in silos, we're not going to experience the results that we want to experience.
Whenever I use Lume's whole body deodorant, I truly feel a level of confidence that is absolutely unattainable to me on other days. Unlike most other deodorants, Lume is powered by mandelic acid, which delivers this outrageous 72-hour control everywhere from your pits to your feet and yes, even your private parts. In fact, it was patients' concerns about their private part odor that originally inspired the OBGYN who first invented Lume. And now, flash forward 6 years, her game-changing whole body deodorant has now earned over 300,000 five-star reviews from people like me. My personal favorite is the toasted coconut scent. It's the one that's in the kind of yellowish, orangish packaging. And if you order their starter pack, that is perfect for new customers. So it comes with a solid stick deodorant, a cream tube deodorant, and 2 free products of your choice, like a mini body wash and deodorant wipes, plus free shipping. And as a special offer for the Real Stuff listeners, all new customers will get 15% off every Lume product with our exclusive code, which is all caps Real Stuff. So if you combine that 15% off with the already discounted starter pack price, that equals over 40% off a starter pack. So use the code all caps Real Stuff for 15% off your first purchase at lumedeodorant.com. One more time, that's code Real Stuff at LumeDeodorant.com. I'm pretty sure this version of Liz, who was working at Mind Body Green and absorbing all this info, is the first Liz I ever met. I was at Refinery 29. You're at Mind Body Green. I believe you invited me to a dinner at your apartment.
That was like Zach. Such a never be. No, Zach wasn't there. This was a never be the one to say no to yourself moment. So my girlfriend and I, she was also an editor, we were like, we want to meet more people in the editorial world in New York City. And so we just made a dream list of other editors that we thought were cool, like other people were working in media. And we were like, come over to our house. We're going to have a little dinner party. And we weren't sure if anybody would say yes, but we were just like, this is a world we want to know more people in. And so many people did. And we had this like cute little dinner party. And
It was so cute. Wait, now that I'm thinking of it, maybe it wasn't Zach. Maybe it was Bella, your cat.
Bella was there. And then my friend Gretchen was the one that I did it with. I loved it as an idea. And I love it as like proof positive of never be the one to say no to yourself. Because I could have felt like a loser, like that you guys would have been like, who is this person? And why is she emailing me to come over to her teeny tiny like a apartment that had no business hosting a dinner party, and I feel like you guys all kind of walked in and were like, oh, like where are we sitting for this for this dinner party?
It was in Brooklyn, right?
Yeah, in Cobble Hill.
You had this adorable 1-bedroom apartment in Brooklyn that had plants everywhere, and I walked into, it was a cook your own situation. So we were chopping food and it was great. I had a lot of fun.
Yeah.
I'm curious because I don't know. I guess I didn't know you well at that point, but I definitely saw some of your work and I had a vision in my mind of who you were and how healthy and mentally well this woman must be. How would you say you were doing mentally at that stage in your life?
Better than I had in a really long time. I think I was less far along on the self-love, self-actualization journey, but a lot further along on the happiness, well-being, and I give a lot of credit to the community. My boss, the editor-in-chief at Mind Body Green, was the best hire in terms of hiring people who ended up becoming my best friends. And so I think having that sense of community really proved to me in a huge way in my life that this is a key pillar of wellness. And it was a huge step for me feeling the way that I wanted to feel each day.
And I'm sure it's just been a very slow and steady transition from then to now. You've since gone off on your own, really focused on your personal social media platforms, built your own audience bigger and bigger. You and your husband have gone off the grid, changed your lifestyle.
Gone off the grid?
I
wish. We've never done that.
I considered you off the grid. You lived a nomadic lifestyle. I mean, I know it was kind of
I feel like I've never not answered a text from you in like more than 5 minutes. So I feel like, how off the grid could I be?
I mean, you're more off the grid than the people plugged in Manhattan, but
sure.
Your life as a nomadic person, do you still consider yourself to be that, or are you more situated now?
No, we're settled in the Bay Area. It's so funny. When I was living nomadically, and I think this speaks to an element of my personality, is when I was living nomadically, I was like, this is amazing. This is the best way to live. How could anybody want to live any differently? And now that I'm settled in one place, I'm like, this is amazing. This is the best way to live. Why would anybody want to live differently? I think it's one of the reasons I even have the job that I have, is because since I was 5 years old, when I feel strongly that I've found the way to do things or the best product or the best tip, I have to tell everybody about it. And I'm just like, oh, guys, I figured it out. Let's go.
Just a little background on that nomadic lifestyle. You guys hopped from Airbnb to Airbnb. Mostly, I feel like you were mostly on the West Coast in better weather.
Yeah, so it was all over North America, largely west of the Rockies, because we like that sort of like mountainy. We kind of just Googled most beautiful mountain towns, North America, and then anywhere that we would find, we would look for an affordable Airbnb there, which ruled out some places like Jackson was on our list to nomad in for a very long time, and we could not find a single affordable Airbnb there. So we did a little week-long trip there at one point, which was amazing. And I was like, why aren't there affordable Airbnbs? I want to come stay here for longer. Yeah, anywhere that had an affordable Airbnb or Vrbo that we could rent for a month, you get a pretty significant discount. And this was the hack that we realized. You get a pretty significant discount usually at that month mark, or you can ask for one. And so because we'd been paying New York rent for years, we could usually find places that were comparable to the rent that we were paying in New York. And it was like getting a vacation plus a life free. And also we were doing it, we started doing it during the pandemic. We were in New York when the pandemic started. We were living in this teeny tiny apartment. It was right next to a hospital. We would hear sirens like all day, all night. And then our landlord tried to raise our rent. And we were just like, we're not going to sign up for like a year of higher rent and living in this situation. So we went to Colorado for a month to live in like a cabin nowhere near anybody, with the idea that we would cool off before moving back to California. People were kind of afraid of New Yorkers at that time. I don't know if you remember that, where people thought we were like all patient zero, even though COVID was everywhere. So we like drove across the country, like peeing on the side of the road, trying not to, we didn't have COVID, like, but we were just like, we won't come in contact with anybody. We'll be as safe as we can possibly be. And then we'll rent this cabin like in the middle of nowhere in Colorado so that we won't come in contact with anybody for a month. And then if we move back to California, everybody will know that we're completely safe. And we just loved it. We were like, this nature, this peacefulness, this stillness, this ability to do our work in the morning and go on a hike in the afternoon after work, it just healed a part of my soul that I did not know needed healing. So we kept doing that for years.
And I'm sure every step of this journey, from the Mind Body Green days to moving to Colorado and then being nomadic for a while, along with all the content you are continuing to create and the experts you've continued to speak to on your podcast and your platforms, all of that probably has contributed to you having what I consider to be probably one of the biggest mental health turnarounds of the century, from where you were to being the author of a book that is just the pinnacle of wellness, teaching other people 100 ways to change their lives and hopefully get to a stage you're at now. And this most recent Hoffman process that you went through, which I highly encourage people to go listen to your full episode on your podcast about, because you answer almost every question someone could have.
Oh, thank you.
Going back to this whole conversation about not feeling like you are enough without validation, without love from the outside world, who are you? And then you go on this journey with 40 other people and nobody knows your job, no one knows who you are, and you feel love. Can you describe what was your initial reason that you signed up for this and thought, I'm going to invest $5,000 to go do this? Did you feel like you had a problem that needed solving, or you just wanted to further explore yourself?
Yeah. And I just want to give a little bit of background on the Hoffman process. So it's a nonprofit organization. It's $5,000 if you want to go for the week, but also a third of every class. There are classes of 30 people and you're with them for a full week. A third of every class is on scholarship. And because they're nonprofit, they're really dedicated to making it as financially accessible to anybody who needs it as possible. And you basically go away to a retreat center. There's one in Canada, there's one in Connecticut, and then there's one in Petaluma, which is the one that I went to. And the process is the exact same regardless of which one you go to. You wake up and by 7:30 every single morning, you're doing parts of the process, and you're doing parts of the process till pretty much 9 or 10 p.m. every single evening. It's like if you took 50 different modalities, from the most science backed to some stuff that's a little bit more spiritual, to just kind of like everything you can think of, and you throw it at people in a very thought through way, but they're throwing everything at you and kind of like, let's see what sticks. And I had heard about it for years, and I started hearing about it from actually like a podcaster who's wildly famous now. I had a girlfriend who was dating that person, and that person was talking about it, and I was like, oh, that kind of sounds interesting, and it sparked a little bit of interest. And then it kept coming up on my podcast over and over, where these guests that I would have would say, oh my gosh, I went to this thing called the Hoffman process, it absolutely changed my life. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. And
it actually had just come up on my podcast from someone who did it when she was 22.
Oh, wow. 22. So they say the youngest you should do it is 21. So
yeah, she said she was the youngest in her group. And then I had never heard of it. She explained it a little, and then I saw your podcast pop up. And
oh, that's like, so interesting. It's so interesting because it's definitely a word of mouth thing where people, when they go, they become obsessed with it and they just want to talk about it over and over, which I'm certainly in that phase a little bit right now. I just kept hearing about it and being like, oh, that sounds interesting. And weirdly for me, because I am a researcher, if I hear about something, I like dive in, I research it, I want to find out everything about it. But something prevented me from doing that with Hoffman. And I just kind of knew the little tidbits that I heard from here and from there. And one day I had a pretty hard time at various points with writing my book. It was a really emotional experience. It's a really difficult experience. I'm so proud of the end product, but it was definitely a journey to get there. And one day when it was just like really hard, I signed up. And when I signed up, I really didn't know like the shape of the days. I didn't know any of that. And I just think it's interesting because Hoffman works the best if you don't know exactly what you're doing every single day getting into it, even though that information is very much available on the internet. But even in my episode, I tried to really focus on the things that I learned, both so that people who weren't ever going to go could enjoy the episode and have takeaways, but also because I wanted to paint in broader strokes what you're actually doing each day. So in case somebody did want to go, they wouldn't have that experience of surprise sort of ruined for them. And I find it interesting looking back that intuitively I didn't ruin that experience of surprise for myself, because that's normally like I've never taken a trip in my life without like looking at everything ahead of, you know what I mean? It's just, it's very out of character for me. And I'm really glad that I did it, because I went in kind of being like, this will be cool. It'll be some sort of like therapy stuff, maybe some meditation. I'll change my life, but I don't know how. And every single day I was blown away. It was much harder than I thought it would be. It was physically harder. It was emotionally harder. It was mentally harder. It's like work, but it was 5 million times more rewarding than I could have been prepared for it to be. I had so many epiphanies. I had realizations, and I really internalized new ways of being with myself and interacting with the world.
Do you feel like by the time you left, you almost had new reasons that you needed to be there in the first place without having been able to articulate that going in?
It's interesting because I think you don't need a reason also to feel like you're going to get something out of it. Like some people obviously go in and they have some trauma that they're trying to work through, but I think all of us have ways that we would like to feel in ourselves, feel in our minds, feel in our bodies, and interact with the world that would just feel more resonant with the people that we want to be. And so I don't even think it's like, oh, I uncovered this trauma or that trauma. I, if anything, developed a radical empathy for far more people in my life. I let go of a lot of resentment for people that I maybe didn't realize I had, to your point. And I developed just like this really deep, beautiful love for my authentic self.
Speaking of the idea of not feeling lovable or feeling like you needed validation from others, that conversation is just so linked to the whole conversation of being on social media, putting your life out there, that back and forth between you and your followers, and the engagement rate and the likes and the comparison that comes with social media. I've heard you talk about it. I've heard a million other creators talk about the way it feels to be a creator and be on social media and have this be our jobs. I know what the quote right thing to say is, or I know what a lot of creators like to say as when they're interviewed, about how do you not let that get to you, or how do you deal with that? How do you really feel about comparing yourself to others and being in this career?
Yeah. So it's funny, when I got into this job, it really came from a deep, deep, deep desire to help people, because I was like, oh, I feel different in my brain and my body. I need to share these things with people. Same as like when I was nomading, I was like, everybody should nomad. This is great. When I started eating things and meditating and moving and discovering that we could rewire our brains in a literal neuroscientific perspective, I was like, other people need to know about this. This is amazing. If I can transform myself in this way, I need to help other people transform themselves. And then in the process of doing the job, I got really caught up in how many views this post was getting and how many views other people's posts were getting. And it was really, really hard on my mental health. And I also really lost focus with like, the reason I am doing this is to help other people and to share this knowledge. I would be more focused on like, what's a post that I can put out that's going to get maximum engagement. So two things. I feel really lucky at this point. My podcast is my main source of my career, and it's my main source of income. It's the main focus of my days. So social media is allowed to be a little bit more supplementary in terms of time, in terms of energy spent, and certainly in terms of income, which lets me use my social media as a beautiful organic space that I can actually connect with people and post the stuff that I want to post. And I recognize that a lot of creators don't have that freedom, and I think we need to like give a lot of grace for that, because people are trying to make a living. And releasing my book and getting to go around the country on this book tour and have all of these people share the impact that my work has had on them was one of the most emotional and beautiful things that I've ever gotten to experience in my life. You create this content on social media or even with the podcast, and you put it out there and you'll get DMs and stuff like that, but it's really hard to get a sense of impact outside of these metrics that you're able to measure. Like,
Right.
it got this many downloads, it got this many views, whatever. So of course, those are the things that you focus on because you don't have much else. So getting to replace those things, or at least supplement them with real people sharing their stories, was transformative. And then at Hoffman, I developed such a sense of gratitude for my job. I was like, I can't believe that I get to wake up every day and be curious and ask questions and try to figure out ways that people can help themselves feel better, have stronger relationships, feel more content, feel more joy, feel more happiness. It almost felt like, okay, the hard part is like done. Like I've built the audience, they're there, they love this content. And the easy part is like embracing it and getting to feel so grateful and so lucky that I get to do this every single day. So I've come really 360 where I went through a really um strained relationship with my job for quite some time, but I started in a place that felt really good and I'm back to being in a place that feels really amazing, and that's amazing. If 50,000 people saw a post before, I'd be like, "Oh my god, this post flopped. This is so embarrassing, blah blah." And now I'm like, "Oh my god, 50,000 people heard a message that might help them change their lives." Like that is wild and incredible, and it blows my mind when I actually think about it.
Now, as a person with a book and you have this huge social media following that you're using to further the message, do you think that you want to be in this field where you're using social media and posting on social media and growing your audience long term? Or do you see your career taking a shift in any way in the near future?
My primary focus is my podcast. It's where the best information that I share goes. It's where the most nuanced conversations happen. You can't have a deep, satisfying, rich interaction on social media. I just don't think that it's designed for that. It's too fast. It just doesn't have the space or the breathing room to allow for that. And a podcast does. A podcast lets people have interactions that feel richer, that feel more nuanced, that feel more filling. It's like the difference between eating some Cheetos and eating like a really beautiful meal. So I'm always going to try to opt for the really beautiful meal. So I'm always going to do the podcast. The podcast is the thing that I feel so lucky is the core focus of my business at this point, and social media will support that.
Okay, final topic here that I must ask. If anyone is an avid listener of the Liz Moody podcast, you've probably heard the series that you've hosted called The Pros and Cons of Having Kids. I'm very curious where you stand today. First of all, I've never heard of a creator be so vocal about going back and forth on the decision of whether or not to have children and having it, really opening up the discussion to different people and hearing from parents and hearing from people who have chosen to be child-free. And I'm curious where you stand today, where you and Zach are with your decision, if you've made one.
I really like my platform to be a space where people feel safe to feel all the feelings. And it's really interesting as I've opened up these conversations, I've heard a lot of messages from people who feel regrets around having children, regrets around not having children, and a lot of shame about the regrets that they have because we haven't created a safe space on a societal level to vocalize those things. So I really like to share what I share about my own journey to help people feel like the way that they feel about their lives, the way that they feel about their choices, the way they feel about these incredibly big, impactful decisions is not wrong. And there's nothing wrong with them for feeling that way. So we have, a whole series about the pros and cons of having kids. Our most recent edition, we had a psychologist on who helps different couples decide whether or not they want to have kids because it's such a huge decision. And I do think people are giving more thought to that decision than they ever have before. And certainly society is letting us give more thought to that decision than we ever have before. I would say with everything that we have learned and all the conversations that my partner and I have had, we're leaning towards having one. Merle Bombardieri is the psychologist who is on the episode that she helps different people figure out whether or not they should have kids or want to have kids, or kind of helps them get in touch with what their actual desires are. And she said a number of very interesting things on that episode, including the age that she thinks is ideal for people to have kids, which was really different than what I thought it would be. But
Wasn't
she
it
said
like 38?
38. Yeah.
Yeah.
And she gives a lot of reasons for that. And I also want to couch this in the fact that she works with a lot of couples dealing with infertility. She specializes in infertility. So that's certainly part of the equation that she talks about in the episode. But she said that one child can be a really nice choice for many couples, not all, who are on the fence. And some people on the fence should absolutely be child free. And I'm not saying like if you're on the fence, just go like grab a child. It's all good. But
just pop one out.
Yeah, just pop one out. It's all good. But my husband and I have discussed it. And that is the direction that we are leaning and that feels best to us at this moment. I do think because of what I've opened up about on my platforms, I've been the recipient of a lot of those like secret negative thoughts that people have about having children. I think that many people are just like, well, why wouldn't you have children? Everybody says it's great. Like, it's great because those are the things we open up about on a societal level. But in my platform, I actually kind of get the opposite, where people tell me all the things that they're afraid to tell anybody else. And Hoffman, you have these really deep, intimate conversations with people, deeper and intimate than you often get to have in everyday life. And people told me some of the hardest parts of parenting, and also I think exposed me to some of the beautiful parts of parenting in a way that hadn't been articulated to me before. And it made me feel more drawn to it than I have previously.
I was going to ask, with all of the pros and cons that you've heard so far, can you share what has been the biggest pro and the biggest con that has stuck out to you?
I mean, I think the biggest con is just that, like, it's really expensive. You lose all of your time. It's like my big thing I'm trying to get my head around is like, well, when's the time where you just like flop on the couch and do nothing? And all the parents are like, that is not something that
Doesn't happen much.
Yeah, that doesn't happen much. The time and the money component are really big for me. And I also think I've had fears around how will it impact my relationship with my husband, whom is my best friend and I love and adore. And I really don't want anything to negatively impact that. On the pro side, I think having a reason to bring a real sense of play and childlike joy into your life, to get to see things for the first time again and explore and bring a sense of whimsy and wonder in. We can do that as adults, and I'm certainly trying to do that more and more, but I definitely think that children provide a great space for that and a great opportunity for that, to be able to shape another human's experience on this planet, to be able to create a human with this person that I love and adore so much, I think is really appealing to me. And again, to circle us back to earlier conversations, I am existentially and experientially ambitious, and the experience of having a child is not one that I've gotten to have. And I'm really interested in experiencing the range of being human, the hardest parts and the best parts and the parts that make you laugh and the parts that make you cry. I think that's all of that is why we're here, which is one of the ways that I've come to embrace, the parts of my life where I was stuck in bed having panic attacks all the time. I'm here as a human to experience all of the sensations of being a human, and that's what makes life so beautiful. And I think that having a child would be a large part of that.
I would agree. I definitely feel the human element of almost being able to identify with everyone that has come before
Mm,
is something I felt so strongly. In a weird way, it almost makes you feel animalistic or like part of a animal kingdom after you have a child, where you just feel so connected to anyone that's ever done this before, that's one area that, I mean, I think I always knew I wanted to have kids. It was always something that I felt very strongly, but that experience of having that connected human communal experience was very drawing for me.
mm.
I think I've been on that segment at least once. Maybe we recorded a second one that I don't know if it's ever gone up. The first one, I was very fresh postpartum, and I think I was maybe giving you more of the cons. It was in a time in my life that it felt very con heavy. And I do remember the second time we spoke coming at the interview with a totally different mindset, where I was coming out of the fog and I felt like, now I'm really pushing the pros here. There are so many pros. And what I'm realizing now, being years out of both of those, is just how in those moments of life, you have no idea how things are going to keep evolving and changing. And
Mm.
it could sound so cliche, but it really just is a journey. Like, if I even go and listen back to myself in that episode, I almost want to shake myself and be like, you don't know what you're talking about yet. Why are you on this show? Even if you had me on a podcast today to talk about the pros and cons, I have a 2.5-year-old. I don't know anything. I can't imagine being in a place where I don't know if I want to have kids, because as I said, I felt it so strongly. And I love that you're having these conversations. It really is probably life-changing for a lot of people.
Well, and to your point, a big thing I've been working on in my anxiety journey recently is I used to try to create certainty in my life because I thought that that certainty would be the thing that would make my anxiety go away. And recently I've realized you can't create certainty in your life. And the thing you need to do is become comfortable with uncertainty. So I've been working on that instead.
Love that. I'm going to leave everyone with that. For everyone who doesn't follow Liz, you must, at Liz Moody on Instagram. Her podcast is the Liz Moody Podcast. Her book is 100 Ways to Change Your Life. What else do you want to leave our followers with today?
That's really it. If mental health is of interest to you, we have a lot of components of the book. We have chapters on how to deal with anxiety, how to have more energy, which I think is really related to anxiety, how to feel happier, all those things. And then we also have a lot of podcast episodes around those topics as well. So I'd encourage people to start there.
Every episode of your podcast, when you intro it and you talk about all the other potential episodes people could listen to, I'm always tempted to get sucked away and go to one of those. But every episode is interesting.
I should do it in the outro instead of the intro. So like I don't
it's good
lose
to do an intro because people might be plugged out by the outro. But
yeah,
I have to say it is enticing. I'm like, oh, I do want to hear that. Truth is, I've probably listened to it already because I'm a live listener. I listen as it comes out. Thank you, Liz. It's been amazing to chat with you. And thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks so much for having me. This was awesome.
Thank you so much for tuning in to The Real Stuff. I'm Lucie Fink. Don't forget to follow the show on social media at The Real Stuff Pod. And if you're liking these episodes, please head over to Apple Podcasts and leave us a written review. It helps the show so much. And if you're feeling called to come on the show, visit luciefink.com/apply and tell us your story. We'll see you next week for another intimate conversation on The Real Stuff.